Hey, Next Big Idea Club. It's Adam Grant. I'm an organizational psychologist at Wharton. I wrote Give and Take, Originals, and Option B with Sheryl Sandberg. I'm delighted to be here with Brad Staats. He's the author of Never Stop Learning, which is one of our summer selections. So Brad, I have to say, you're passionate about people being continuous learners. I'm really disturbed about the number of CEOs I meet who don't read books. And it seems to me like they've stopped learning. What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Adam. I mean, I think we have this challenge of almost an activity bias, that we feel like we always have to be doing something rather than ever taking the time to step back, to think, and to learn. And I think kind of reading falls right in the middle of that, we kind of jump from one task to the next. And reading actually means we need to at least slow down a little bit, right? We have to be willing to change instead of always running at the same thing over and over again. I'm curious. I saw your list just came out of kind of your top 12 books from your summer, that you're looking at. How do you find time to read so much given your schedule?
Wait, you can't turn the tables on me, right? This is my interview, so I get to put you in the hot seat. But I guess, my quick thought on that is I feel like reading is a highly productive activity. One, because I get to accumulate new knowledge that I can apply or share or, might lead me to some new projects. But also, too, because everything I read is a chance to help an author out who wrote something worth spreading that often is hard otherwise to really discover. So for me, it feels like it's totally aligned with my goals, but I also realize that I have a job where reading is in the job description. So I want to ask you about a bunch of themes that were fascinating to me. The first thing is, I guess, on the subject of disturbing. You write about some research that you did where you find that, if I remember correctly, it's cardiac surgeons who are great at learning from other people's failures, but they don't learn from their own failures. Can you walk us through what you found and why it's so hard for us to learn from our own mistakes?
Yeah, no, so that study's kind of a personal favorite. So what we looked at was a bunch of data on cardiac surgeons and their procedures over time, and we had information on whether they succeeded or whether they failed. And unfortunately, in that context, failure is losing a patient, having a patient die. And so you can think about, you have this challenge that when you have a patient die, there's kind of two explanations. One could be looking at, okay, this is what I did wrong, this is what I need to improve upon. The other is, maybe I was unlucky. Sometimes people are just too sick. Sometimes you gave your best efforts and it didn't work out. And so what we see in the data is that, when other people around the surgeon fail, subsequent performance improves. There's actual learning. But unfortunately, when surgeons have failure themselves, they don't seem to learn from them. And I think this gets at one of the real challenges that we all have with learning is, are we willing to admit what really happened? This idea, sometimes known as the fundamental attribution error. We have to decide, hey, was it me? Was it the environment? And when we look at ourselves, well, it could have been, no, definitely the environment, right? It had to be, that I was just unlucky. And so there's this element that, all too often as people, we see what we want to believe instead of seeing what's really there. And if we want to be effective learners, we've got to figure out, strategies, techniques to see what's actually there.
So if I'm a surgeon and you're trying to help me overcome this bias, and I'm sitting there saying, yeah, there are 19 patients that died on my operating table, but none of those are my fault. What do you say to open my mind and get me a little bit more oriented toward learning, or at least to overcome my defensiveness?
Yeah, I think one of the things we see at hospitals that really do this well is they'll put kind of boards in place to try to explore what was the cause of the different outcomes, with a recognition that it's never fully a person's fault, it's never fully unlucky. There's always a mix of the two, and so what those boards do that's so interesting is they don't get set up to assign blame. It's not hey, this is for our malpractice insurance. Rather, it's let's take this apart and really see what's going on. And I think that's what effective learners, when things go wrong, they ask themselves, hey, what could I have done better, right? Not at to the sense where they paralyze themselves, where they're afraid to move forward, but where they're really willing to admit, hey, maybe I have some responsibility here.
Is there such a thing as asking that question too often? Because for years, every time I give a speech or a guest lecture, I asked the audience or the host, what's the one thing that I could do better? And a few years ago, I got feedback that I was asking for too much feedback.
It's a great question. I mean, I don't know that you can ask for too much feedback. I think that it is true that you have to be careful not to respond to noise, right? I mean, because I could imagine, like in that presentation example, one group wants you to tell more jokes, one group wants you to be more serious, and so you end up kind of swinging back and forth. And so I think that's the danger of asking too often. But I honestly would rather get the feedback and then turn to some outsiders to make sure you get help in evaluating it. That we can't just look at it ourselves, because we may miss those important points.
And so I guess I want to rewind a little bit, because when we start to talk about helping people learn, it seems like onboarding and training programs are pretty broken. And so one of I think the most fascinating studies that you've done looks at how we should actually bring people into an organization so that they can learn from the start, but also they can bring what they already know to the table so that other people can learn. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you've begun to reimagine onboarding?
Yeah, so this is a project that began, frankly, on at the end of a long day when I was in Noida, India, sitting down with the chief quality officer at a business process outsourcing firm. And we talked all about productivity and learning, and at the very end of the day, I turned back to him and said, hey, what questions do you have for me? And he said, how do we reduce attrition? How do we kind of decrease turnover? Not a surprising question. Indian outsourcers had north of 100% turnover, and I spent the whole flight coming back, with good Lord, what can I do? I study learning by doing at that point, and if by doing 6 months is too late, too many people have left after 30 days. And so worked with a couple of colleagues that we shared, Dan Cable and Francesca Gino, and we sat there and we kind of thought about, what could we really do to reimagine this? What would look so different from the experience that any of us have had onboarding that might actually reshape how somebody thinks about the firm? And so as we had that conversation, what we came to appreciate was that the onboarding experience is normally about the organization. You come in, let me tell you what the rules are, you're all nervous, so that makes you feel a little bit less stressed. I get you to follow the rules. But what if we flipped it on its head? What if we made it about, hey, who are you as a person? How can you bring that person to work? And so we went back to the company and we pitched them on a field experiment where we would take an hour the first day. And in that hour, we'd talk about kind of how you could be yourself at this job, come up with a personal highlight reel, introduce yourself to others, and then we gave them a fleece at the end of it that had their name on it, a little badge as well. Since people like free stuff, we had an organizational condition. You talked all about the organization and you get a fleece with the company name on it. And then we watched them for 6 months. That was it. 1 hour on the first day plus a fleece. At the end of that 6 months, a little bit over actually, we found that folks were far more likely to stay at the firm in the individual condition. And the story, as we dug in there from talking to the participants, as we went and we looked, we did some lab experiments to follow, was really one of authentic self-expression, of being yourself. I love the quote from Steve Jobs. He said, look, I don't hire smart people to tell them what to do. I hire smart people so they can tell me what to do. And I think when we look at onboarding, when we look at starting within organizations, we have to recognize what are we doing to activate versus instead kind of shut people down. And all too often, at least in my experience, it's been either the latter or simply apathy.
So one of the other things I was curious about is I've been asked for years by students, should I go deep or broad? Should I be a generalist or a specialist? And you make a strong point in the book that there's actually a right order to this question, and there's a perfect time to specialize, and maybe there's an ideal career window to start to diversify your expertise. Can you walk us through how that works and how we know when it is time to make the shift?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one that has kind of bugged me, throughout my life. I mean, much of my research is frankly me-search, those questions that I wish I had an answer to, and realize, hey, my job is to try to answer this stuff, so why not give it a shot? I think we look at specialization or variety as an either or, when in fact it's really a story of and, but it's and over time. That specialization in the moment is incredibly important, that we have to be careful bouncing around from too many things at once. There's all sorts of reasons. Some of them are productivity reasons, that simply we don't multitask the way we'd like to believe we can. We're single task processors. Some of it we can only hold so much in our brain, and so as we stay in kind of a focal area, as we get deeper in that area, we learn. We take advantage of kind of one of the most powerful elements for learning, the learning curve. Do the same task over and over again, you get better. The challenge is you get better, but at a decreasing rate. That learning curve flattens out. And that's kind of your sign that, hey, I need to jump onto another curve. I need that variety. I need to be bouncing around. The variety really does two things. One is it's motivating. We like doing some different things. Many of us, most of us, frankly, get bored if it's the same task over and over and year. Where that is set kind of depends on the person. But when we switch, we're more motivated. And when we switch, we learn. So much of innovation is combining kind of existing pieces that we know, but doing it in novel ways. And so, what's interesting then is specialized at first and then variety over time. And it's what some folks will call a T-shaped learner, right? The specialization is digging down deep. The variety then is the horizontal part of that T. And that way you avoid being kind of a specialist with too limited knowledge, as well as kind of that jack of all trades, master of none. Put them together.
Do you have any data on sort of the average window in different industries? So, do I specialize for 3 years and then start to think about adding another skill set? Does it take 5 years? Does it take a year? What do we know, if anything?
Yeah, so we did some research that was very task focused. It was in a Japanese bank. And so in that study, it was task processors all in the same basic job, but they could do the same task, or they could instead kind of switch across different activities, all part of mortgage processing. And in that context, what we saw was over a couple of months, it was good to be in one task, but kind of as time extended, then you wanted to move across them. I haven't seen good data. I'd be curious, kind of you too. I guess my instincts would tell me that it's going to be a function of kind of the knowledge in that learning curve. That, if I think about when I worked at Goldman Sachs out of undergrad, and I don't know what it says about me, but I loved the job. It was a lot of fun. I hadn't done finance before, and so working those really long hours, was fine at that stage of life at 22. But by the end of the 2 years, I felt like in creating, spreadsheets for common stock comparisons, I kind of reached a flat point. Like it was definitely time I needed to move to something else. And so I would suggest that, the deeper the knowledge you need, the longer it's going to take. So becoming an orthopedic surgeon, is, a bunch more years to get there. It's probably a decade or north of that. Doing a mortgage process, yeah, sure. Kind of a month might get you there. I don't know have you seen data on it?
No, I haven't, which is why I was hoping you could solve the puzzle for me. But I get the appeal of variety, especially if you're working on a task that's repetitive. But I think if I understood you correctly, you're also saying that the very moment that I finally get good at something, I have to quit doing that and start up the learning curve and be a novice all over again. Do you have any sense of how to balance mastery with continuous learning?
Great question. I wouldn't put it quite that strong form. I think, again, if I look at the people I've interviewed, if I look at kind of how it resonates with me, what I find with a lot of folks is once they get onto that flat part, when they have that mastery, that eventually they get a little bored. They get interested in wanting to extend it, right? And so, physicians are a group I spend a lot of time with, and this is a pretty common discussion I have with folks, in their 40s, that, they spent kind of a good chunk of their 20s, 30s getting med school, residency, fellowships, then years becoming an expert at stuff, and now they find, hey, what's next? I'm ready to climb another hill, and I can't do it. There's nowhere to go directly. And so, I think there's an element of it to recognize it's a personal choice. If you're mastered something, you kind of feel like you're in your element, then it may not be time to make a change, right? Keep progressing on. But I think, right around, that point is when there's the opportunity to start to scan, the opportunity to think about, well, what's new? What's a new procedure maybe I could consider? How might I extend this in a slightly different way? And I think we find people pick a lot of different paths, whether that's an industry, whether that's moving up in leadership ranks, or sometimes it's just on the side, right? Instead of doing it in the full-time job, maybe it's a side hustle as a way to get that engagement and that learning.
It seems like a lot of the themes you write about in the book, I had this sort of visceral reaction of, yeah, I should be doing that, but I don't do enough of it. It might be what our colleagues Pfeffer and Sutton would call a knowing-doing gap, where you sort of recognize, hey, this is an effective practice, and then you look at your calendar and you start thinking, yeah, I'm a total failure when it comes to doing the practice. And I'm curious about what advice you have for closing those kinds of gaps. So we were talking earlier briefly about reflection and how important reflection is, but how few leaders actually do it. What can you suggest for making sure that we actually do build that time into our schedules?
Yeah, so I mean, in part, this is why I'm both an operations professor and a behavioral scientist. That I mean, when I started studying learning, I thought it was just a matter of figuring out the processes, right? As a good engineer, you have inputs, you have outputs, kind of map them together, and we're done. And as nice as it would be, perhaps if it worked that way, we've got people, and people gum things up, right? This is why the psychology matters so much. And so things like you're pointing out, this reflection. I mean, I think folks like Stephen Covey got it right. I mean, this tyranny of the urgent over the important is kind of a constant theme through life. That we know what we should do, but then somebody walks into our office asking if we can go to this meeting or if we can knock this out for them, and we know it's not as important as an alternative, but it's right there in front of us, and so we go ahead and we run down that path. And so, as I wrote the book, part of it was to, hey, let's understand the behavior, the psychology, and why we get in the way. But I actually think we can go back to some of the operations, some of the process side, to come up with a better approach. That one of the things the research tells us on both sides is that we often do a better job taking care of our future self as opposed to our present self. So in the moment, right now, if you ask me, hey, am I going to reflect for 15 minutes or am I going to go down the hall and chat with somebody? I might have the urge to go down the hall and chat with them. On the other hand, if I'm making my schedule for tomorrow or for next week, I might actually do a pretty good job of blocking it, saying, look, I need to knock out an hour in the morning to write. It doesn't matter kind of when my day starts. It doesn't matter what else is going on. I've got to have that hour to write, or I need that 15 minutes to reflect. And so I think one of the strategies I'm a big fan of is very actively managing the calendar. Blocking that time depends where you are. Some places you can tell everybody what you're doing, and others you might need to just kind of come up with a code word. So look, I'm in a meeting. That meeting happens to be myself reflecting. But coming up with those sorts of really accountability approaches and processes to protect ourselves from ourselves, frankly.
So that reminds me of another question I was wondering about when I was reading Never Stop Learning, which actually popped back up this week. I got 4 different emails from people essentially asking the same question, which is, they say, I actually have a big problem when I read behavioral science, which is I learn about a whole body of research, I have all these new ideas, and I have this immediate high and I want to go implement them. And then a day or a week later, they're gone. I only remember a couple of the insights and I act on even fewer. And it almost seems like the issue is not that I need to keep learning, it's that I just need to keep what I've already learned in my head and then follow through. What have you learned over the years about retaining what you learn?
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the story is not trusting just our head. That, as thoughtful as inevitably, kind of all of the members are, that we've got a lot going on. It's tough to kind of keep kind of that, top of mind. And so there is, a heavy element of writing, of putting these things down, of putting our plans, down, even if we recognize that, in going through that, I love the quote from Eisenhower, I think it was, who said, planning is everything, the plan is nothing. So, the fact that we have that list by itself isn't the driver, that we've gone through and reoriented, we've come up with some new processes, that helps guide us. That, I just actually was listening to Option B the last couple weeks in the car, and, good ideas would come up a couple times while driving, and I actually had to then stop and write something down, because I knew, at first I was like, oh, I'll just put it in the back of my mind, but that was never going to stick. And so I think that when we look at behavioral science, that's a whole lot of it, is yes, listen, but it's not just edutainment. It's not just, okay, I've heard it now, I'm transformed. You actually have to sit down and go through some planning, go through some writing, and thinking about that restructuring. The other piece is, as any good change management initiative would tell you, if you try to change everything at once, you're changing nothing. So, pick, 1 or 2 things to work on, make some progress there before you add in the next thing.
So that goes to something I wanted to ask you personally. I think one of the more disappointing discussions I've ever had was a few years ago. I ran into Danny Kahneman at a conference, and I asked him how his decision-making approach has changed in light of everything he's learned about heuristics and biases. And he looked very glum, and then he said, well, after I make bad decisions, I'm more likely to recognize why. that was sort of the end of it, right? That I understand my foibles and my flaws better, but I haven't been able to do much with that knowledge. And I'm wondering, as an expert in learning, what are the biggest changes that you've made to your daily habits or to your own learning practices that have been beneficial? And please don't give me the Kahneman answer.
Exactly. I haven't reached the status of Kahneman to get away with that as an answer yet. So thankfully, practicing at least some of what I preach here. I think the point is a sound one, right? That awareness by itself is a first step, but if that's all we ever do, then it kind of fades away, right? And we just have that little bit of understanding. I think one of the big changes for me has been reflection, for sure. I am far more careful with my schedule now than I was. I'm still, I think my wife would say I'm not careful enough. So I'm a big fan of working with other folks and perhaps a little bit too packed. But making sure that I've blocked some of that time to think about things, that I've taking that time to step back is a really big one. I think another one that's been huge for me is a willingness to ask questions. I definitely fell prey kind of in the early stages of my non-academic career and my academic career of being in a room and feeling like I always have to have an answer. Somebody raises a question and I'm the expert, right? I'm supposed to stand here and ironically enough, what I found is the more I know, the more comfortable I am saying I don't know. And I found that to be incredibly freeing, frankly, that it takes a pressure off that even in this conversation, as I was thinking about things beforehand, I'm like, I wonder what Adam and I are going to talk about. What if he asks me about something I have no idea, right? I was like, you know what? Then I'm going to say, I don't know, and ask him what he knows. And together we're going to learn something from that. And so I think that element of it's less about impression management and it's more about learning has been really important, at least for me.
So I'm curious to hear more about this reflection process that you've started. So you block time, that's the first step. I've rarely been given good advice on how to structure reflection. So I'm thinking about an experience I've had, I'm thinking about my effort to learn a skill or master a task. What are the kinds of questions you ask yourself, or what is even the journaling that you might do look like?
Yeah. It all started for me out of a research project because when I had been in industry and gone to training programs that had reflection, I rolled my eyes and I'd move my hand like my pen was writing perhaps, but very little reflection actually took place. And so then I found myself teaching and in the front of the room, asking people in a program to do a learning journal and felt just a little bit hypocritical. And so we worked with a company where we took a 6-week training program. We randomly assigned folks to participate or not in this reflection exercise. For the middle 2 weeks, they simply did 15 minutes of what are 2 things you learned today. And then we asked them to kind of write about those 2 things. At the end of this program, they ended up performing about 25% higher on the test to qualify to do their job, about 10% higher in their customer satisfaction scores. So I've translated that to me with the first thing is what are 2 things you've learned today? I think maybe you do something similar. We go around the table at night at dinner at home and we ask our kids about something that made them happy, something made them sad, something they learned as we go around. And then depending on the topics, we'll incorporate failure as well, something you failed at today. So for me, I'll start with what are 2 things you learned. I'll then typically, if failure hasn't come up in those, then I'll do some reflection around failure, making sure that both I'm pushing myself hard enough and kind of that back to the openness to failure and thinking about it. And then I'll usually try to leave a little bit of time to let it wander. I think one of the challenges is we're often so scripted in our schedules that we don't let ourselves just kind of see where our minds go with that. And so my hope is that in that time, hopefully about 15 minutes, that it consolidates the lessons learned, but it also opens up where I'm going next. Within the recognition, that's not the only time to really think about stuff that I'll come up with something and then realize, okay, I actually need to devote a bigger chunk of time to run after this. But what I'd suggest is for anybody out there, even just starting with, hey, what are 2 things you learned today, is a great way to turn reflection into learning.
In all these years of reflection and research, are there things that you used to believe about learning that now you think are wrong?
That's a great question. I mean, yes, constantly, I feel like. I certainly would say I probably subscribed to the learning styles approach early on, assuming that was right. And I think we've come to appreciate that, we may have some preferences, but we can learn from all different sorts of approaches. I think that, so Carol Dweck's work around mindset is incredibly powerful, right? This idea that, as we have kind of a fixed mindset where we think kind of our intelligence, right, is limited, or that learning mindset, growth mindset, that it can increase. I think there were parts of me and parts of life, I would say, parts of skills and tasks that I would have put more in that fixed view. And certainly, being exposed to that and more broadly, I see now, look, you can teach an old dog new tricks, just that old dog has to be willing to learn. And so that helps me internalize when I'm struggling with something, I can't do this, and kind of the internal monologue of, no, Brad, you actually can. Are you willing to put in the time and the effort to keep it going? And so I think some of that, pushes it back on me, at least, as I look at it. I don't know, I'm curious, I love that question. For yourself, is there anything as you look at the topic that you'd highlight from kind of your younger self to today that's changed?
I think, actually it's funny that you brought up learning styles, because I believed in them for a long time too. And I thought, okay, I'm clearly much more of an auditory learner than a visual learner. In the sense that when I hear something, I just remember it, and often seeing a picture of it, I look at it and I'm like, why do we need an image? Like, you have the words, just remember the words. And I knew people who felt the exact opposite. And I think we've been reading a lot of the same research that has just over and over again debunked the idea that these styles are meaningful in terms of learning effectiveness. And so I think one mystery for me, which maybe you can solve, is a few times when I've started to share evidence about how learning styles are not that critical to how we learn, people say, but wait a minute, if these are preferences, if we like learning a certain way, aren't we going to be more intrinsically motivated? And doesn't that mean we'll engage more, we'll remember more, we'll get more out of the experience? And my first thought in reaction to that is to say, well, actually sometimes we get more out of learning experiences that are hard, because we have to put more of our energy into them. And so learning in the way that's maybe not your default style or not your comfort zone forces you to invest more in the learning process, and it makes it more productive. Do you think that's part of why the preference doesn't lead to better learning, or is there more to that story?
No, I think that's certainly kind of my impression as well. Writing a book isn't a bad example. That there are parts of it that came really easy. There are parts that were extraordinarily painful. I think that some of those painful parts are where I learned the most, as you're banging your head on the wall and I can't do this, but no, you can, as you're talking to yourself, and then you put things together in a new way, right? We know their value in obstacles. That perhaps we don't have to go quite as far as that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, but at least that which challenges us certainly makes us stronger. And so if we always leave it to kind of the trivially easy, then we're likely to severely limit our learning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I guess it goes to my first thought when you asked the question back of what are things I believed about learning that maybe I don't anymore. And I think I used to think about learning as coming right out of a reflection process, and I found over time that oftentimes for me reflection just leads to rumination. So I'll start by saying, okay, let's analyze a failure. Why did I fail? And then I actually, in high school, I remember getting an award. It was the If Only Award on my diving team. It was a little paper plate award that my teammates drew. And it had a little cartoon of me saying, if only I had pointed my left, fourth toe on that dive, I might have gotten a 7.5 instead of a 7. And I would just replay that scene over and over in my head, and it didn't feel developmental. I think over time what I've come to realize is that reflection is useful only when it's keeping pace with new experiences. So that before I just reflect on the same experience over and over again, I want to go into that situation again and see if I can approach it differently. And then the reflection is much more about, okay, I'm going to juxtapose those two performances or those two practices, as opposed to just repeating the same image or scene over and over again. Is that something you run into a lot, or am I just a total weirdo?
Well, I'll leave the final question for you to reflect on. But on the first part, actually, I think there's a great tension here, and I think this is true across learning. That there are a lot of things that are good in measure. So take this point of there's this concern of paralysis through analysis, right? You're always coming up with, well, what if, what if, what if? At the same time, if all we're doing is, kind of you're jumping off the board constantly and you're not thinking about it at all, each of those is an extreme that's unlikely to be successful. And so I love kind of the idea of, look, ready, fire, aim. And so, we should have a proclivity to doing stuff, but it's not just fire, 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 fire. We have to think about it too. And so I've gotten this question before of, hey, in Search of Excellence, Peters and Waterman talk about, you need an action bias. And you're saying, hey, we're too concerned about doing stuff. Isn't that a problem? I guess, if you modified it and said, we need a thoughtful action bias. We need to be out trying stuff and seeing what works and then thinking about it and going. Then yes, I'm fully in favor of that. It's just all too often we break off that reflection piece. But I think your point of, I run into folks on each side. Some are too busy. They never take the time to think. Some, play that what if so far that they don't actually get out and try new stuff.
So Brad, in closing, I'm curious, we didn't really talk about why you wrote a whole book about why we should never stop learning. And my hypothesis was that if you want to keep learning, what better way to do it than to put a flag in the ground and say, hey, I'm the learning guy. But was there anything else that motivated you to pick this topic and to write a whole book about it?
Yeah, this is really why I came back to academia. So I had worked in investment banking and strategic planning, venture capital, got my own MBA, and was just struck how I saw individuals and organizations perform. They had such similar resources, but performed really differently. And so I wanted to know why. Why, if we had all of this advice out there, didn't we see more similarities? And kind of my rudimentary understanding was that it was a story of learning. And so I knew at least that much when I came back to academia, but probably not a whole lot more beyond that if you were to go read my application. And so this has been a question that's bugged me for a long time. It's one, I had one of my best friends read the book recently, say some nice things, and he said, Brad, I feel like, you've more started the conversation than finished it, which was one of those, is that a compliment or a swipe? But I'm going to take it as a compliment because I think, learning is so fundamental to where we are today. We're very much in a learning economy, I would argue, not just a knowledge one, that even if we can scratch the surface, there's a chance to hopefully in the ensuing years, get a whole lot deeper in the topic.
Great. Well, Brad, I got a lot out of the book. I know the Next Big Idea Club will as well. And I want to thank you for joining us today and sharing a lot of what you've learned to help all of us learn.
Great. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it.